If you have a reactive dog, you have probably tried a common training approach that focuses on engagement, such as asking your dog to look at you or perform a cue such as touch or sit-stay in the presence of a trigger. But what if that is really not solving the problem? Today, I'm going to explain to you why engaging your dog during a reactive episode does not really address the root cause. And I will also share a different approach that can give you and your dog real, lasting progress. Let's break down what exactly we mean by engagement approach to reactivity. When a dog encounters a trigger, many dog owners tend to ask their dog to do something, such as give them eye contact or go into a sit or down stay. And the idea is that it distracts the dog from the trigger and instead keeps them focused on the handler. At first glance, that might seem like a good approach. And if you have a dog who's very food-driven or who has a long history of engaging with you, it seems to work at first. When the dog is engaged with you, they may well stop reacting to the trigger. But there's one big issue. Just because your dog is not reacting while they're focused on you does not mean that they are no longer reactive. And thus, engagement can mask the symptoms without addressing the underlying issue of stress and reactivity. Think of it like this. Let's say you're feeling really sick and miserable, and then you watch a TV show that completely captivates your attention. For a little while, you forget about how sick you're feeling because you're so focused on the show. But once the show ends, all the discomfort comes rushing back. In this case, the discomfort was still there. You were no longer sick. You were just distracted in the moment. And your illness faded into the background while your attention was elsewhere. And that's what happens with the reactivity if you only use engagement approaches. When your dog is engaged with you, they're distracted from their stress. But once the engagement ends, the underlying stress resurfaces and your dog can go right back into reactive outbursts. So even if your dog is non-reactive and seemingly calm as long as they are engaged with you, the second that focus is broken, maybe because you run out of treats or the dog is distracted by something, they may revert to reacting. And that is why engagement methods on their own often are not enough to address reactivity in the long term. For some dogs, especially highly motivated and well-trained ones, engagement techniques can be even more misleading. Those dogs have a long history of rewards and reinforcement for paying attention to their owner. When they see a trigger, they might be eager to engage with their handler because they've been rewarded for it many times before. And that makes it look like they are no longer reactive. But typically, as soon as we stop the engagement, they go right back to reactive outbursts. For example, take a dog that's super food-driven. And by the way, in my opinion, very food-driven dogs are difficult to train in reactivity because their food drive can mask so much stress. If your dog has had hundreds of successful experiences of being rewarded for looking at you, they might stay engaged even when a trigger is close by, because their food drive in that moment is stronger than their stress. But again, it does not mean that the dog is truly no longer reactive. It just means that they're distracted enough by the treat, but not that they have actually learned to cope with their triggers effectively. So, what should you do instead? In my training approach, I let the dog look at the trigger if they want to. The key is not to make them no longer look at the trigger ever again. The key is to manage the intensity of the trigger so that it is low enough for the dog to experience it without reacting. That is known as counter-conditioning desensitization, and it teaches the dog that trigger do not mean danger. Instead of trying to keep the dog distracted with constant cues or treats, I focus on the dog's experience. I let the dog encounter the trigger at a level they can handle, and I use food to encourage calm behaviors such as sniffing. It helps the dog relax and process the situation, but the food is never used to force the dog to stay under threshold. If you have to constantly use food or cues to keep your dog from crossing their threshold, it means that the trigger intensity is too high. And as soon as you're no longer able to deliver a constant stream of treats or give your dog commands, they will go right back to reacting. This is a subtle but powerful difference between engagement techniques and the low-intensity trigger training method we teach in our Tackling Reactivity program. In our approach, the goal is always that the dog can coexist with the trigger without needing to be distracted, constantly engaged, or fed. The goal is for the dog to be able to stay calm without relying on you or food to keep them under control. So we really do not want to keep our dog distracted from the trigger forever. We want to help them learn that triggers are not something to freak out about. We do not want our dogs to be so reliant on cues or food that they can't cope on their own. Instead, we want them to understand that they can just be around triggers, and it's fine. This is why we let our dogs experience the trigger in a safe and controlled way, so that they can process it and learn to relax. This approach is not about distraction or forcing your dog to engage with you. It's about letting them discover on their own that the trigger is no longer a threat. If you're stuck in a cycle where you constantly need to rely on food or cues to keep your dog under threshold, it might be time to try something new. The method I teach helps dogs move past that dependency on engagement cues and food. It's about building real resilience to triggers. Last but not least, I'd love to hear from you. Have you tried engagement techniques and did you hit a plateau where your dog was requiring constant cues or food from you to stay under threshold? If so, I'd love to help you break through this stagnation and further move along in your journey towards reactivity training success. As always, if you have any questions, just drop them in the comments, and I wish you happy reactivity training!